I woke up to what looked like a music festival on my land. 500 tents, RVs, and campfires stretched across my pasture like a neon rash. And right in the middle of it all stood Karen, the HOA president, balanced on a plastic table with a megaphone declaring, "Welcome to the Freedom Campout." I didn't remember sending out invitations. I sure as hell didn't remember giving anyone permission to treat my grazing land like a state fairground. My neighbors cheered, cracked beers, and lit bonfires while my posted "no trespassing" signs flapped in the breeze, ignored like old newspapers. Now, a lot of people would have called the cops, maybe begged the sheriff to come clean up the mess. Not me. I poured my coffee, walked down to the gate, and smiled. Because if Karen wanted a show, I was about to give her one she'd never forget. Before I tell you exactly what I did and why 500 campers ran screaming, drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is right now. You don't grow up on a ranch without learning two things fast: how to mend a fence in under 10 minutes, and how to spot trouble walking toward you from a mile away. Trouble, in my case, wore a wide-brimmed sun hat, carried a clipboard, and answered to the name Karen. Now I inherited my land from my father, who inherited it from his. We weren't wealthy, but we had roots deeper than the fence posts sunk into the soil. 200 acres of grassland and a modest herd of cattle, enough to keep me busy, honest, and grounded. On the east side of the property, just past the tree line, the HOA development had sprouted up like weeds. Vinyl-sided homes, cookie-cutter yards, and a board that believed every blade of grass should match their bylaws. Karen was the self-appointed queen of that board. She'd moved in about 4 years ago, and within 6 months she'd declared herself president. Nobody else wanted the job, and Karen thrived on power like a plant on sunlight. The problem? She hated that my ranch disrupted her perfect suburbia. My fence line, barbed and weather-worn, didn't match her community aesthetic. My bulls, huge, lumbering, gentle creatures, were, in her words, a liability and an eyesore. It started small. Letters in my mailbox about unauthorized vegetation growth. Petty warnings about the noise of livestock. I laughed them off at first. I figured if the HOA wanted to waste paper, that was their problem. But the letters escalated. Then came the meetings, the threats to fine me for not joining the community, even though my deed predated their development by 40 years. The final straw came when they paved a so-called community trail right up against my fence. One of their glossy brochures bragged about access to greenbelt views. The greenbelt, according to them, was my pasture. I walked the line with my survey map, shaking my head. Their stakes were off by at least 20 yards. Still, they acted as though my land was an extension of their picnic tables and yoga mats. Karen, of course, loved to strut the trail like it was her personal catwalk. Clipboard in hand, she'd stop joggers and dog walkers to announce how she was negotiating with the rancher to open up the pasture for community events. She never asked me. She just declared it like my silence was consent. I kept my cool for a while. See, my father used to say, "Son, don't get in a shouting match with a fool. Folks might not know the difference." So I didn't shout, I documented, I posted signs. I checked my fences every evening, making sure the barbed wire was tight and the gates were locked. And let me tell you about my bulls. 24 head, black as midnight, bred heavy for grazing rotations. They looked mean, but they were steady as rocks, trained to follow feed buckets and the sound of my whistle. Most folks don't realize that bulls, if handled right, are calmer than nervous horses. But they're still bulls. 2,000 pounds of muscle and horn that command respect just by existing. I loved those animals like they were family. Karen hated them. She called the county once to complain that wild animals were endangering her subdivision. The county agent came out, took one look at the herd, patted me on the back, and told her to go home. That only fueled her fire. So when word spread that the HOA was hosting a freedom campout on the Greenbelt, I didn't pay much mind at first. They'd done little events before: potlucks, yoga retreats, even an outdoor movie night. They were noisy, sure, but they stayed on their side of the fence. But then a flyer landed in my mailbox. Bright colors, bold font: HOA, freedom campout, music, food trucks, bonfires, camping under the stars, dates all weekend, location community Greenbelt. I knew that language. Greenbelt was HOA speak for my land. I marched down to the HOA office, really just a rented clubhouse, and asked for clarification. Karen, in her sun hat and floral blouse, didn't even look up from her clipboard. She said, "The maps show it's part of our shared space. Don't worry, we'll clean up after." I laughed out loud. "You'll clean up after 500 people camping on my pasture? Lady, you can't even get your board to clean up the dog park." That got her attention. Her lips thinned, her pen scratched across her clipboard, and she said, "This is bigger than you. The community deserves to enjoy the land. You're just being selfish. Selfish. That was her favorite word. I pointed at the survey map I'd brought. This is my deed, my fence line, my property. Step one more boot on it, and you're trespassing. She smiled that fake HOA smile, the one that didn't reach her eyes, and said, "We'll see about that." I walked out knowing exactly what was coming. And sure enough, by Friday afternoon, the line of SUVs, campers, and RVs stretched half a mile down the county road. My driveway was blocked by a pair of HOA security volunteers wearing reflective vests and smug grins. They waved me down like I was a visitor. One of them even said, "Sorry, rancher, the campground's full. You'll have to park elsewhere." I leaned out my truck window and said, "Son, you're standing in my driveway." He blinked, then looked back at the sea of tents springing up behind him. I saw fire pits being dug into my grass, generators coughing fumes, kids running wild, tearing down my no trespassing signs like they were souvenirs. And in the middle of it all, Karen climbed up on a folding table with her megaphone announcing that the community spirit has won. I didn't call the sheriff. I didn't even honk my horn. Instead, I sat there in my truck, watching my bulls grazing calmly at the far end of the pasture. A slow smile spread across my face, because I already knew exactly how this story was going to end. Friday afternoons on the ranch used to mean quiet. The sun would dip low, painting the fields gold, and I'd lean on the fence watching my herd graze. Peaceful, predictable, but not this Friday. This Friday, my gravel road rattled under a convoy of SUVs, campers, and lifted pickup trucks, hauling trailers stacked with kayaks, coolers, and folding chairs. It looked like the opening scene of a county fair, except the fairground was my land. The HOA had promised a freedom campout, but I hadn't pictured it like this. RVs wedged nose to tail along my fence, tents sprouting like weeds, and portable stages being hammered together by teenagers who had no idea they were standing on private property. Smoke curled from half a dozen grills, music thumped from portable speakers and generators, sputtered diesel fumes into the summer heat. By the time the clock hit 5, the easement road to my ranch was clogged. Strangers spilled beer on my gravel drive, blocking my truck like I was the intruder. I rolled down my window and tapped my horn. A man in cargo shorts and a neon vest swaggered over, puffing out his chest like he owned the place. "Sorry, buddy," he said, waving me off with a plastic badge that read HOA Security. "Campgrounds at capacity. You'll need to park elsewhere." I stared at him. "Elsewhere, son, you're standing in my driveway." He blinked. "Oh, this is the community greenbelt, right?" "Number." "This is private property," I said, slow and clear, like I was teaching phonics to a kindergartner. "Belongs to me, deed and all. You and your campers are trespassing." His smirk faltered. He muttered something about checking with President Karen and jogged off. A few minutes later, Karen herself appeared, clipboard under one arm, megaphone in the other. She looked like she was auditioning for a reality show. Big sunglasses, wide-brimmed hat lips curled in that permanent smirk. "Oh, it's just the rancher," she called out, her voice amplified. "Don't mind him, folks. He's being dramatic." The crowd laughed. Some lifted their beers in a toast. Karen waved her hand at me like I was an unruly child. The community has spoken. The greenbelt is ours to enjoy. I stepped out of my truck. The heat rolled off the asphalt, but my temper burned hotter. "Karen," I said, voice low but firm, "you've got 500 people on my deeded land. Every fire pit, every RV, every folding chair trespass. I've got signs posted every 50 feet. I've called the county before about this road, and you know damn well where the boundary lies." Karen raised her megaphone again. "Ladies and gentlemen, don't worry. He's just trying to intimidate us. The law is on our side." That line got a cheer. Phones shot up into the air, recording. And just like that, I knew what Karen's real game was, making me look like the villain on social media. Well, two could play that game. I pulled out my own phone, hit record, and walked straight to one of my no trespassing signs, already torn half off the fence. I filmed the busted post, the fence line, the crowd spilling past it, and Karen's smug face behind her megaphone. I narrated every detail like I was hosting a crime documentary. Then I called the sheriff. When the deputy finally rolled up an hour later, his cruiser had to crawl through a gauntlet of RVs and beer coolers. He got out, adjusted his hat, and looked at me like he'd seen this circus before. "Evening, sir," he said. "We've had a few noise complaints. What seems to be the issue?" I gestured wide. "The issue is 500 trespassers on my land. This campout not permitted. These people cutting fences, blocking my drive, digging fire pits into grazing pasture." Karen hustled over waving papers. "Oh, don't listen to him. This is a civil matter. We're exercising our right to community enjoyment of the greenbelt." The deputy took the papers, skimmed them, then gave me a look. She's right, sir. This is a civil dispute over boundaries, not criminal. I can't remove them without a court order. I clenched my jaw. So they get to stay. Until a judge says otherwise. Karen grinned like she'd won the lottery. The campers roared approval. The deputy tipped his hat apologetically, muttered something about being short-staffed, and drove off. Just like that, I was left standing in a sea of strangers, burning my pasture into ash and calling it fun. But here's the thing, I didn't lose my cool. Not yet. Because while Karen thought the law was her shield, I knew better. My father always told me, don't waste your breath fighting on their terms. Let the land do the talking. So I went back to my house. I poured another cup of coffee, and I opened the binder of survey maps, property deeds, and open-range livestock laws I'd kept tucked away for a rainy day. Because if the HOA wanted a festival, I'd give them a parade, one led by 24 bulls weighing a ton apiece, and I'd make damn sure every camera in that crowd caught it. When I was a kid, my dad taught me something. Most folks in the city never learn the law. Isn't always written in the courtroom, it's written in the land. Property lines, water rights, grazing easements, those rules were inked long before Karen ever bought her vinyl-sided palace with an HOA badge to wave around. So while the campers blasted country music and lit bonfires, I sat at my kitchen table under a single lamp, thumbing through a binder older than me. My father's survey maps the deed, even notes from a lawyer friend who'd once fought off a developer trying to carve up our pasture. It was all there, black and white, the fence lines, the boundaries, the grazing easement that predated the subdivision by decades. Karen thought she was clever, calling my pasture a greenbelt. Legally, it wasn't. It was a working ranch with livestock protections, and our county had open-range statutes that gave me more leverage than she could dream of. I didn't plan to storm out there swinging fists. No, I wanted the HOA's downfall to be slow, methodical, undeniable. So I started with paper. First, I typed up a formal notice of livestock movement. Clear language stamped with the date, filed with the sheriff's office, the county ag commissioner, and animal control. It explained that beginning Saturday at high noon, I'd be moving bulls from one pasture to another, perfectly legal, perfectly ordinary ranch work. Anyone on the property without authorization would be responsible for their own safety. Then I drafted a letter to the HOA board. No threats, just facts, trespass, nuisance, liability. I attached photos of torn fences, trampled grass, and fire pits dug straight into dry pasture. I cited county code about fire hazards and illegal gatherings without permits. By sunrise, I had copies delivered sheriff, county clerk, HOA office, even taped one to Karen's shiny new Lexus parked crooked on the trailhead. See, when you deal with someone like Karen, you don't just fight back. You build a wall of receipts so high that when the truth comes out, there's no place for her to climb down. After breakfast, I drove into town and met with my friend Dale, an ag lawyer who owed me a favor for pulling his truck out of a creek last winter. He took one look at the photos and whistled. "Hell, this is open and shut," Dale said, flipping through the evidence. "You've got trespass, property damage, nuisance, environmental violations, and with that livestock notice, you're covered 6 ways from Sunday." "That's the idea," I said. Dale leaned back, grinning. "So what's next? You calling the bulls?" I just smiled. Let's call it a community demonstration. Back at the ranch, I spent the afternoon getting ready. I set up cones along the north gate, marked the cattle trail with bright ribbons, and parked my tractor near the drive so nobody could claim they didn't see where the herd would move. I even hired 2 wranglers from down the road, brothers named Jake and Tom, who knew my bulls as well as I did. We walked the herd that evening, checking hooves, topping off water troughs, and shaking feed buckets to remind them of the routine. The bulls were calm, snorting quietly in the dusk, big shadows against the horizon, steady as granite. Meanwhile, the Freedom Campout roared on the other side of the fence. Music blared, kids screamed, generators rattled like diesel dragons. I caught sight of Karen on stage, megaphone in hand, shouting about taking back the commons. She looked like a general in some HOA army, drunk on power and cheap wine. I didn't rise to it, I just documented. Trail cameras clicked from every angle, capturing trespassers, stomping across posted signs, cutting wire to make space for their tents, even siphoning water from my stock tanks. Every clip, every photo went straight into a new folder on my laptop labeled HOA Evidence. By midnight, the camp smelled like a landfill. Overflowing trash bags sagged against my fence. Gray water dumped straight into my pasture, pooled into a slimy ditch. They'd turned my land into a festival ground, and not the kind that cleaned up after itself. But here's the funny thing, I wasn't angry anymore. I was patient, because I knew the clock was ticking. At noon tomorrow, my bulls would move. Not rushed, not forced, just steady, deliberate, and legal. And when 500 campers found themselves face to face with 2,000 pounds of horn and muscle, the sheriff's civil matter excuse wouldn't mean a thing. Before I turned in, I called the sheriff's office one more time, left a polite voicemail. Just letting you know, deputy livestock movement scheduled tomorrow, documented and lawful. Wouldn't want anyone to be surprised. Then I slept like a baby. At dawn, I woke to the sound of generators sputtering, someone's dog barking, and the faint thump of bass. Karen's circus was still going strong. I brewed my coffee, whistled for Jake and Tom, and checked the herd one more time. Their hides gleamed in the morning, light, calm, and ready. By 10 a.m., word had spread. A few campers whispered nervously about cattle coming through. Most brushed it off, thinking bulls were like overgrown puppies. Karen strutted around with her clipboard, telling anyone who'd listen, he won't dare. We've got the law on our side. But the law wasn't on her side. It was in my pocket, in every notice, every time-stamped photo, every county statute that backed me. And when the clock struck noon, the only law that mattered was the oldest one. Respect the land or get out of its way. I walked up to the north gate with Jake and Tom. My hand rested on the latch. The bulls lined up behind the fence, massive and silent, as if they knew exactly what was about to happen. Karen spotted me from across the field. She raised her megaphone and sneered. "Don't you dare." I smiled. "Oh, I dare." And with a click of the latch, the pasture began to move. High noon in July is no joke on a ranch. The sun hangs overhead like a white-hot coin, the air thick enough to drink, and every sound carries farther than it should. That's why, when I swung open the north gate, the first snort from my lead bull echoed like a cannon across the field. 24 bulls, heavy and black, as storm clouds lifted their heads. Their shoulders rippled horns, glinting in the sunlight. Jake whistled low beside me. "Lord, they look like a cavalry." "They are," I said, slipping the latch chain into my pocket. Slowly, almost lazily, the herd began to move. Dust rose under their hooves, curling into the still air like smoke signals. To anyone who understood livestock, it was just a normal pasture shift, calm, deliberate, controlled. But to 500 campers clutching their solo cups and selfie sticks, it looked like the ground itself was waking up. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some scrambled for their phones, climbing onto coolers to get a better angle. Drone cameras lifted, buzzing overhead, catching every angle of the bull march. Within minutes, live streams popped up online. I could practically hear the view counters clicking upward. Karen, ever the showman, grabbed her megaphone. "Don't panic," she barked, her voice cracking. "Stand your ground, he's bluffing." But no one believed her. Not with 24 bulls fanning across the pasture, their snorts vibrating the air. One of the younger bulls kicked up his heels, tossing dirt like he was showing off. The crowd shrieked, and scattered tents collapsing as people stumbled over each other. I stood with Jake and Tom, each of us holding a staff, guiding the bulls with subtle whistles and gestures. We didn't push them. We didn't need to. The herd knew their job: move slow, follow the line, respect the handlers. These weren't wild beasts. They were ranchers' bulls, steady as tractors. But the campers didn't know that. To them, it was chaos. Kids screamed. Parents dragged them toward SUVs. A food truck peeled out, leaving a trail of spilled nachos. Someone tipped over a generator, sparks flying as the crowd stampeded away from it. Karen clung to her folding table, shouting into the megaphone, "This is harassment. This is dangerous. Stay calm, they can't touch us." Right on cue, one of the bulls brushed against a luxury golf cart parked too close to the fence. The metal crumpled like a soda can, setting off its alarm in a hysterical wail. The bull snorted, unimpressed, and kept walking. But the crowd lost it. "Call 911, someone screamed. "They're going to kill us." Funny thing is, the sheriff was already there. I'd called him the night before, remember. His cruiser rolled up just as the bulls entered the middle of the campground. He stepped out, took one look at the controlled herd and the panicked mob, and whistled. "Well, I'll be," he said, adjusting his hat. "That's one way to clear a trespass." Karen rushed toward him, megaphone still blaring. "Arrest him. Arrest that rancher right now. He unleashed wild animals on innocent families." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, those are livestock, not wild animals." And according to this notice, he pulled the folded paper from his pocket. He told us this drive was happening. He's within his rights. Karen sputtered. But look at them, they're terrifying." The sheriff glanced at the bulls, calmly plodding along in formation. "They look pretty well behaved to me, safer than half the folks driving ATVs out here." The wranglers and I guided the herd toward the south pasture, keeping the bulls moving like a slow tide. The campers had no choice but to retreat, their tents collapsing as they scrambled out of the way. Drones whirred overhead, streaming the spectacle to thousands of online viewers. And I'll admit I enjoyed the show. I enjoyed watching the HOA's self-declared victory festival unravel into chaos, enjoyed the sight of Karen's perfect plan reduced to dust under the hooves of cattle she claimed didn't belong. But I wasn't reckless. Every step had been calculated. Cones marked the herd's path, ribbons fluttered along the safe zones, and the wranglers kept a close eye on stragglers. Not a single person was harmed, though you wouldn't know it from the screaming. By the time the bulls reached the south gate, the campground was a wreck. Folding chairs scattered like leaves, coolers tipped over, spilling beer across the grass. Half the RVs had pulled out in a rush, leaving ruts deep enough to break an axle. Karen stood trembling, her hat askew, her clipboard bent in half. She raised the megaphone again, but her voice cracked. "This isn't over. He endangered us all. I'll have his ranch condemned if it's the last thing I do." The sheriff crossed his arms. "Ma'am, from where I'm standing, it looks like you endangered them. No permits, fire hazards, trespassing. You're lucky no one's been hurt." Karen dropped the megaphone, her face redder than a branding iron. I tipped my hat, whistled for the bulls, and shut the gate. The pasture was quiet again, but the battle was far from over, because I knew Karen well enough to know that humiliation alone wouldn't stop her. She'd come back with lawsuits, accusations, and half-baked schemes, and that was fine. Because I had something she didn't: every second of this circus captured on camera, every trespass documented, every violation stacked high and ready for court. The HOA wanted a war, then they'd get one. Only this time I'd be holding every piece on the board. If there's one thing I've learned about people like Karen, it's this: humiliation doesn't humble them, it fuels them. By the time my bulls were back in the south pasture and the dust had settled, Karen was already reloading. She stormed off toward her Lexus with the megaphone dangling like a defeated flag. I figured she'd lick her wounds in private. I was wrong. The next morning I got served. A manila envelope landed in my mailbox, an emergency injunction request filed by none other than the HOA president herself. Claims of endangerment, reckless intimidation with livestock, and my personal favorite: psychological distress caused to innocent campers. She wanted the court to ban me from moving cattle across community property. She wanted damages for property destroyed by bulls. She even accused me of animal cruelty for forcing livestock into hostile conditions. I laughed so hard I spilled coffee on the papers. But I didn't laugh for long. I knew courts take injunctions seriously, even ridiculous ones. So I called my lawyer friend Dale. We met in his office, the stack of evidence sitting heavy between us. "Looks like she's trying to paint you as a rogue cowboy," Dale said, scanning the complaint. "Good news is your prep work makes her look like the clown." And he was right. Because while Karen was screaming into megaphones, I'd been building a wall of receipts: trail cam footage showing campers cutting my fence with bolt cutters, drone clips of tents pitched on my deeded land trash piled like landfills, photos of no trespassing signs ripped down and used as firewood, videos of me politely informing the sheriff and posting notices ahead of the livestock drive, and the golden ticket, the official letter from Animal Control praising the bull's condition and confirming the movement was lawful and controlled. Karen had theatrics. I had facts. But she wasn't finished. That weekend, county inspectors rolled up. Environmental officer, fire marshal, even a public health agent. They'd all received anonymous complaints about my unsafe property. They poked around, took notes, asked questions. Then, one by one, they shook their heads, not at me, but at the HOA camp. The fire marshal wrote citations for illegal bonfires and fuel storage. The environmental officer nearly gagged at the gray water dumped straight into my pasture. The health agent issued fines for unpermitted food trucks and waste disposal. The HOA's little festival was unraveling faster than a cheap sweater. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down. She marched around the subdivision with her clipboard gathering signatures for a community petition to revoke my grazing rights. She even staged a press conference on the cul-de-sac, ranting about a rancher terrorizing families. But the cameras she invited didn't capture a martyr. They captured a woman unraveling, red-faced, shouting, waving papers, while neighbors shuffled awkwardly behind her. And when reporters asked about the county citations, she snapped, "Those are lies, fabricated by the rancher." Fabricated, hard to say that, with drone footage of overflowing porta-potties leaking onto the grass. Sponsors who'd supported the Freedom Campout bailed instantly. Local businesses didn't want their logos tied to citations and lawsuits. The HOA's insurance carrier quietly froze coverage, citing pending investigation of unpermitted events. That meant every fine, every damage claim, every cleanup bill would come straight from the HOA's budget. And who led the HOA? Karen. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet in public. No rants, no interviews. I let the evidence do the talking. Behind the scenes, I compiled everything into a neat binder. trespass, nuisance, property damage, environmental hazards. Every photo timestamped, every report notarized. When I finally sent my own complaint to the court, it landed like a hammer. I sued the HOA for trespass on private property, fence cutting and property damage, illegal dumping of gray water and trash, nuisance caused by noise and traffic, attorney's fees. Karen wanted to make me the villain, but with every document I flipped the script. She wasn't the victim. She was the ringleader of a trespassing mob. The sheriff even backed me up. He filed a supplemental report noting that the livestock movement had been scheduled and lawful and that the crowd's panic resulted from their own actions, not the bulls. By the time the first court date was scheduled, Karen's emergency injunction had already collapsed under the weight of my evidence. The judge tossed it like yesterday's newspaper. But here's the thing, Karen still didn't quit. She started whisper campaigns through the HOA newsletter, warning about dangerous livestock. She pushed for special assessments to cover legal fees, blaming me for dragging the community into court. And her neighbors. They weren't buying it. Their dues were skyrocketing, their lawns were being cited to death, and their board meetings had turned into screaming matches. One neighbor, a tired-looking dad with kids hanging off his legs, muttered to a reporter, "Honestly, I'd rather live next to the bulls than deal with Karen." I couldn't have scripted it better myself. Every day that passed, Karen dug her hole deeper. And me, I just kept stacking receipts. Because I knew what was coming next. The climax wasn't a herd of bulls trampling a golf cart. It wasn't a sheriff shrugging at her clipboard. It was a courtroom showdown. And when that gavel finally dropped, I'd have more than victory. I'd have leverage. By the time the court date rolled around, the HOA was bleeding from every vein Karen had opened. Fines, citations, cleanup bills. It was like watching a slow-motion car wreck. But Karen still strutted like a peacock, swearing she'd have me condemned by the judge. I almost hoped she'd believe her own story because confidence makes the fall that much harder. But before the courtroom came the breaking point. The weekend after the Bulls' march, the HOA staged one last hurrah. They called it a family fun day to reclaim the Greenbelt. Fewer people showed up, maybe 100 instead of 500, but it was still a circus. They set up bounce houses, food stands, even a stage for karaoke. I watched from my porch with a cup of coffee, shaking my head. The audacity of throwing another event on the very pasture that had already buried them in legal trouble, it was peak Karen. Sure enough, trouble came faster this time. One of the bulls lounging by the south fence snorted when a drone buzzed too close. He tossed his head startled, and the crowd screamed like the sky was falling. People panicked, sprinting toward their cars, trampling tents and coolers. In the chaos, a bull brushed against a shiny luxury SUV. The metal caved in with a crunch, the alarm blaring like a siren of doom. No one was hurt, not a scratch. But perception is louder than reality. Within minutes, rumors spread that the bulls had charged the campers nearly gored, a family trampled property. Videos flew across social media, chopped up, to make it look worse than it was. The sheriff rolled in again, lights flashing. But this time he didn't look at me. He looked straight at Karen. "Ma'am," he said, voice clipped, "you've ignored county orders, hosted unpermitted events, and endangered public safety. This ends today." Karen sputtered, clutching her clipboard. "He's the danger, he sicked wild animals on us again." The sheriff gestured at the bulls, who were calmly chewing cud like oversized statues. "Those animals are on his property, ma'am. They didn't trespass. You did." Then he gave the order, "Evacuate." Deputies moved in, directing cars out in single file. Campers folded up what little they could salvage, leaving trash and broken equipment in their wake. Karen shouted into her megaphone, trying to rally them, but no one listened anymore. Her voice cracked, drowned out by the sound of tires crunching gravel as families fled. By sunset, the Freedom Campout was nothing but a field of trash bags and ruts. The HOA's dream of a community utopia had collapsed into a landfill, and standing in the middle of it was Karen alone, shaking with fury. She jabbed her finger at me across the fence. "I'll see you in court, rancher. I'll bury you there." I tipped my hat, looking forward to it. And I meant it. Because while Karen thought the courtroom was her salvation, I knew it was my battlefield. 2 weeks later, we stood before the judge. Karen arrived with a legal team. The HOA could barely afford 3 lawyers in sharp suits, armed with binders and bluster. She wore a bright red blazer, her lipstick like war paint. I walked in with Dale, my ag lawyer friend, carrying a single binder thicker than a family Bible. Inside, every photo, every video, every report, every receipt. Karen's side went first. They painted me as a reckless cowboy endangering families with feral livestock. They claimed emotional damages, property loss, reputational harm. They played shaky phone clips of bulls walking calmly through the pasture, narrating them like they were horror films. When they finished, Karen leaned back in her chair, smirking like victory was already hers. Then Dale stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He laid out the evidence with surgical precision: survey maps proving the greenbelt was deeded pasture, trail cam footage of campers cutting fences and tearing down signs, sheriff's reports confirming my livestock movement was scheduled and lawful, county citations for fire hazards, illegal dumping, and unpermitted events, all against the HOA. Insurance notices suspending coverage because of the HOA's violations. Finally, Dale handed the judge one last document, a set of tax lien receipts. See, while Karen was busy running her circus, I'd been busy too. Months earlier, I'd quietly bought up delinquent tax liens tied to several HOA common area parcels, which meant if they defaulted, I had first claim to their so-called greenbelt. The judge flipped through the documents, eyebrows raised. So not only did the HOA trespass, but their president misrepresented ownership of land they don't control. Karen's smirk collapsed. The ruling was swift. The court dismissed. Karen's claims upheld my rights and ordered the HOA to pay damages for trespass, nuisance, property damage, and legal fees. On top of that, the judge compelled the HOA to reimburse county fines and fund repairs to my fence line. But the hammer didn't stop there. With the liens in hand, the judge acknowledged my legal leverage over portions of the HOA's common areas. In plain English, Karen had tried to steal my land, and in the end I gained leverage over hers. The gavel cracked like a rifle shot. Case closed. Karen slumped in her chair, her clipboard lying forgotten on the floor. The neighbors who'd once cheered her now whispered about recalls and resignations. As for me, I walked out lighter than air. Not because I'd crushed her in court, but because I'd done it the right way, with patience, preparation, and a little help from 24 bulls. And when reporters shoved mics in my face asking if I had anything to say, I just smiled. Boundaries matter, I said. Respect them or you'll get moved. When the gavel dropped, Karen's empire cracked like thin ice under heavy boots. The HOA board, once her loyal chorus, sat in stunned silence as the judge read the ruling. By the time the court adjourned, their whispers weren't about fighting me anymore. They were about replacing her. The settlement terms rolled in fast. The HOA was ordered to pay for every scrap of damage their campout had caused: fence repairs, soil restoration, water tests for contamination, even reseeding the pasture where their RVs had left deep ruts. They were fined for illegal dumping, fire code violations, and unpermitted gatherings. And yes, attorney's fees, every last one. But there was more. The judge compelled the HOA to fund a community restitution project. Ironically, that meant their dues were funneled into something useful, for once rebuilding fences, clearing trash, and sponsoring a 4-H scholarship for local kids who wanted to learn ranching skills. In short, they paid to fix what they broke and give back to the very lifestyle Karen had mocked. And Karen? She resigned within a week. Not willingly, she was forced out. After the court decision, angry neighbors packed the HOA meeting hall. People waved copies of skyrocketing dues notices and county fines. A tired mom shouted that Karen had cost her family 3 months' mortgage payments. A retired veteran said, flat out, "You turned this HOA into a circus." Karen tried to defend herself, clipboard shaking in her hands, but it was no use. The board voted her out on the spot. She left red-faced and trembling, muttering about appeals and revenge, but everyone knew the game was over. The new board president, an older gentleman named Harris, came to see me personally. He stood at my gate, hat in hand, and said, "On behalf of the HOA, we're done fighting you. Let's fix this fence and move on." I shook his hand. That's all I ever wanted. Over the next month, the transformation was almost surreal. Crews hauled out trash bags by the truckload. Volunteers from the subdivision helped reseed grass, sweating under the same sun they once cursed me for hogging. Kids in sneakers hammered fence staples alongside my wranglers, laughing as they learned how to stretch wire tight. For the first time in years, the fence line wasn't a battlefront. It was a boundary respected by both sides. One evening, as the sun set orange across the hills, I walked that line alone. The bulls grazed quietly in the south pasture, their shadows long and calm. No bonfires, no blaring music, no RVs clogging the road, just peace. I stopped by the repaired north gate, running my hand across the fresh cedar post. It felt solid, stronger than before, and in that moment I realized the land hadn't just survived the chaos, it had reclaimed its dignity. Karen vanished from the subdivision soon after. Rumor had it she sold her house at a loss and moved 2 towns over. Maybe she found another HOA to terrorize. Maybe she didn't. Either way, she wasn't my problem anymore. But the best twist of all, thanks to those tax liens I'd quietly purchased, I now had leverage over several of the HOA's so-called common parcels. Not to take them, I didn't need them, but to ensure they'd never try a stunt like that again. Every board meeting from then on had to acknowledge in writing that the rancher next door wasn't to be crossed lightly. And honestly, I didn't feel vindictive. I felt steady. Like the land itself had delivered justice in its own slow, deliberate way. Sometimes you don't win by shouting louder. You win by standing your ground, stacking your receipts, and letting the truth weigh more than their lies. As I leaned on the fence watching the bulls graze under the fading sky, I whispered a thank you to my dad. For the binder he left me. For the lessons about patience and paperwork. For reminding me that ranchers don't need to start wars, the land fights for us if we respect it. The road was quiet again. The gate was locked. And for the first time in a long time, I slept with the window open, listening to the crickets sing across a pasture that was once again mine alone. This whole mess taught me something I want to pass on to you. Boundaries matter not just on a ranch, not just in property lines, but in life. People will always test them. They'll push, they'll prod, they'll try to convince you that community or common good is a reason to trample what's yours. But standing firm isn't selfish, it's survival. The trick is how you stand. You don't have to scream, you don't have to swing fists. You gather your facts, you hold your patience, and you act when the moment's right. Like those bulls, slow, steady, deliberate, you move forward with purpose, not panic. And when the dust settles, you'll see who respected the boundary and who crumbled under their own noise. So if you're facing your own Karen, remember paper weighs more than shouting. Receipts are sharper than insults. And patience, that's your strongest weapon. Drop a comment below, tell me where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to fight to defend your own boundaries. And don't forget to hit subscribe because more HOA stories are coming, and trust me, you don't want to miss them.